My father's friends fit into two categories: car mechanics and sheriff's deputies. No matter what type of jam you got yourself into, one or the other could get you out. After my mom died and I became Dad's tag-along, I got dragged to dark garages that smelled of oil and part shops filled with dusty yellow and black Bussmann fuse boxes. You would think that with his friends being mechanics, my dad would have driven a really nice vehicle. Looking back, though, I realized that while they were all mechanics, none of them were really good mechanics. Being a man with a tremendous heart when it came to his friends and small animals, just like he took in any stray, he bought, on the cheap, every auto project gone wrong. Being dropped off at school each morning was an embarrassment, an ongoing embarrassment that my father simply never understood. Dad had two best friends, Junior Statham and Huck. I never noticed it at the time, but Junior was a very handsome man. I did not realize this until I saw my first Glenn Ford movie, and came to notice how Junior looked just like him. Huck, on the other hand, was a slightly taller version of Boss Hogg, round in belly and face, with sausage fingers that perpetually held an unlit saliva-soaked cigar, and a bright red face hidden under a cowboy hat. Both were excellent at restoring cars and trucks. Junior restored a 1950 F-Series Ford truck with a pristine white paint job. Being a kid, I wasn't thinking so much of the art as I was how much money he could get by selling it. He never would, though, always claiming that no one would give him what he put into it. Looking back, I bet that no matter what he offered for it, he simply would have turned it down, just not wanting to sell his baby. A couple of years after I graduated, Huck showed up driving this shiny black car. I have long since forgotten the model. It could have been a Pioneer, it could have been a Phoenix or a Matador or a Comet. It was around 1959 or 60, or maybe it could have been later. It was slung to the ground, without the fins, but with the big round googly headlamps. It was the deepest, shiniest black I had ever seen in my life, and the interior was an immaculate white vinyl. It was possibly the most beautiful vehicle I had ever seen. I cannot remember if Huck bought it or restored it himself. I wouldn't have thought that he had the money to restore it all by himself. Back then I assumed that everyone was as poor as we were, but nothing is the way you remember it. Huck could have had a mattress full of $50 bills for all anyone knew. I was at the age where the world revolved around me and me alone, so exactly where the car came from, I didn't think on that greatly. Everyone joked that I should just ask Huck to sell it to me and take it for my first car. I knew I'd never have the money to purchase it. Secondly, I knew Huck would never sell it to me. Thirdly, even if I had it, it was obviously not a car to cruise around town and have fun in. You couldn't drive it without being afraid of scratching it. You couldn't eat inside it. It had a factory AM radio with knobs, so you couldn't have any good music in it. It didn't stop me from dreaming about how cool it would be, though, to have that car for my own. Another reason I cannot remember much about this time of my life, aside from segging from my teens into my 20s, was the fact that during this time my father was dying of cancer. We lived in a tiny town where the hospital initially diagnosed his prostate cancer as just a mild bladder infection. And so, when he was being treated, he was being shuffled back and forth from Big Spring to Midland to Lubbock. Thanks to a completely psychotic stepmother, I was being shuffled around quite a bit myself. My dad always managed to somehow keep her at bay, but my life with her could make another essay altogether, and my sisters feared for my safety once my dad was no longer in the picture. I went from one sister to another to an empty house that used to belong to my grandmother on my dad's side, which sat abandoned and surrounded with a huge gated fence, locked up and safe. I was shuffled back and forth to college to visit Dad wherever he was and back again, all through that winter of that long-ago year. One night, very shortly before he passed, I found myself in the hospital with him in Midland, with no way of getting back home. Huck had come to visit, and he offered me a ride, and I remember my initial delight as I looked out Dad's window to see that black, shiny car waiting for us in the parking lot. We stepped out into the room and into the elevator. Neither one of us spoke, and it was about this time that I realized, after 40 years of friendship, this would possibly be the last time Huck ever saw my father alive. I had no idea what to say to him. This man who had bought me sodas at the truck stop with my dad, who teased me when I bleached my hair, who had taken off from his own job for the last 2 years along with Junior to drive my father back and forth to his chemotherapy. We stepped outside and the sun was setting. It was cold anyway. Winter in West Texas was no walk in the park, but as the sun began to sink, a mist rolled in that bit right through whatever you were wearing. It sank its icy claws straight into your bones. Huck opened the door for me, and I slid across the clean, white vinyl to find there were no seat belts. Huck started the engine, and the radio that only played AM stations began to glow with the pull of the headlamp button. I would soon understand why there was no need for seat belts. The car would not go over 45 miles an hour. We began to drive back to Big Spring from Midland, about a 40-mile drive. We sat in silence, the heater barely battling back the chill and never actually warming us. The radio played static and oldies on and off as signals came and went. I tried not to show how much I was shivering, to keep Huck from feeling even worse than he already did. The miles moved at a snail's pace, the fog and mist otherworldly as it swirled around us. I remember only speaking to Huck one time, in a feeble attempt to make conversation. I asked about the mile markers that were passing gradually by our windows. I asked about the numbers on them. How did they know how many miles it was? How many miles from what? Huck said he did not know, possibly the number of miles from where that interstate began. We stopped for gas at the saddest, most miserable little gas station I can remember. Huck offered to buy me something to eat, though eating was the absolute last thing I wanted to do, even though the service station offered nothing but suspicious sandwiches pre-packaged in plastic triangles with no expiration date. I accepted the offer. To do anything else would have been rude. I made sure to thank him and forced myself to eat something I barely tasted. As we rolled back into the night, the car was no longer that shiny dream machine it had been before. It was black, serpentine, and sinister. It was a choking, stifling thing that stole my will to speak, to empathize with anything, but to sit there and watch Huck, wishing to God I knew something to say that would make it all right. Struggling to make it back up the ramp and onto the highway, it occurred to me that this was no longer an automobile. I was riding in a phantom that was stealing my father's spirit. Every mile that we rode from the hospital, the car cutting through the mist, the angel of death was pulling my father's soul from his body. I was not riding in a classic car. I was a passenger in my father's own hearse. I stepped out of that car, never wanting to lay eyes on it again. It is possible that Huck felt the same way. After that, he went to driving this monstrosity, this hybrid, of what looked like a 1-ton truck and an RV that I had heard he picked up in a card game in Dallas. My father never made it home from the hospital, and he died 1 week before Christmas. I can still taste the stale bread in my mouth, washing it down with a big red soda as I shivered on the seat, terrified of spilling that bright red bubblegum-flavored soda all over the immaculate white vinyl seats. The trip was endless and freezing. I do not remember what immediately came before, nor do I remember what came right after. However, that drive is frozen in my memory. The glow of the dashboard, the old-fashioned dials of the radio, the chrome, my breath misting in front of me, and the sinister creep of the fog that pursued us all the way home.